for the first question, so we're looking at coterminal angles. Let me just select the pen. Okay, great. So they're asking us which expression finds the measure of an angle that is coterminal with a 45-degree angle, right? So first of all, let's just define what a coterminal angle is. If you recall, back to math class, right? If you have a coterminal angle, so say for example, you have a 45-degree angle, that means you're going to share the same initial side, right? Let me draw that. Okay, so you have your quadrants, right? So respectively, you have quadrant 1, 2, 3, and 4. So what a coterminal angle is, so say for example, I'll give you just a really quick one or a simple one. So if you have, let's say 45 degrees, right? So I'm starting from quadrant 1, right? And this is 0 degrees. So this could also be in radians, right? But because we're focusing on degrees, so that's what we're going to focus on. And because it's a positive 45-degree angle, that means it's going to come from this 0 degrees as opposed to the other way around. Does that make sense? Because otherwise, if you have negative 45 degrees, then you're going to start from the bottom, right? So it's counterclockwise for positive 45 degrees, and if it's clockwise, then it's going to be negative 45 degrees. But because we want a positive one, right, let's focus on that. Great, so we have this initial side, right, which is this 45 degrees, right? So if you have a coterminal angles, right, because they're giving you 250, 370, 180, and negative 360n, right, it's either you add or subtract, right, depending on the given angle. So right here, your coterminal angle, right, you're going to be sharing that initial side. So that means the coterminal angle would be this angle over here, right? Okay, great. So I think I've covered that. Okay, so let's get into the question. So maybe let's look at what they wrote. So here for part A, they're saying you have 45 degrees and you have 250 n degrees, right? So remember, because it's supposed to be a coterminal angle, that means you need to have degrees, right? Sorry, this is your angle first, and this is equal to your angle that you're looking at. So this is the total angle if you think about it. And this is your angle, which is the 45 degrees, and this is plus. So this is supposed to be 360, right? Because when we're looking at coterminal angles, right, we're looking at the entire quadrant, right? So if you remember a reflex angle, it's like 360 degrees, right? It's like one big circle. So that's why you have 360, and depending on what your teacher uses for the variable, it could be n or k. So let's say we're using n because that's what the question is telling us, and you have degrees over here. Okay, so let's see. Because they're adding, right? So as you can see, okay, so they told us that D is true, which is this part. Okay, so let's try to read what they have. So it says two angles, theta 1 and theta 2, are called coterminal angles if they have the same initial side and same terminal side. That's right. Okay, great. So when they say initial side, for example, remember the 45 degrees that I mentioned? So this is the initial side, right? And you have another angle that's going this way, right? And this is your terminal side. Okay, so that's what theta 1 and theta 2 is. And it says when you subtract the 2, you get 360, right? Where m is an integer. And if it's not equal to 360, basically it's not coterminal. So when they say you have an m over there, what that means is it needs to be a multiple of 360, right? That's why you have an integer. So in that case, it could be 360 degrees times 2, right? If you have 360 degrees times 2, that would be 720. So 720, if the two angles sum up to 720 degrees, that means it's still going to be coterminal, right? And let's say you're looking at 250n, right? So what they showed you, right? So let's say you have 45 and you have plus 250n. So they're saying that let n be equal to 1, right? So if you add a 2, you get 295, right? So this 295, this is theta 2, Does that make sense? And you have theta 1, which is 45 degrees. So if you have 45 and you have 295, when you subtract the 2, you get 250 degrees, right? So theta 1 is 45 and you have theta 2, which is 295, right? So the most important thing here is if you see that 250 degrees is not a multiple of 360, right? That means it's not going to be coterminal. That's why A is false, right? Now let's move on to part B. So for part B, they're saying you have 45 degrees, then you have 370 n degrees for any integer n. Okay, so let's go to B. Now you have n is equal to 1. Great. So we have 370 degrees, right? We sum up the two. We say that 45 degrees is theta 1. Then you have 415 degrees, which is theta 2. Remember, we need to subtract the 2, right? Based on the formula. So yeah, this theta is equal to theta plus 360n. If you rearrange this equation, you can say that you're subtracting the 2. Okay, so you have 415, right? And then you have 45 degrees, so that's equal to 370. We know that 370 degrees, regardless of whether you have an integer of 1, 2, or so on and so forth, it's not going to be a multiple of 360, right? I think it's pretty obvious. So that's why we're going to say that B is false, and this is correct. Now, if you move on to part C, right? So for part C, they're saying that, let's see, 45 degrees, right, over here, plus 180 n degrees for any integer n, right? So I think they're using 1 again for n is equal to 1. And let's keep it simple. You don't have to go and use n is equal to 2 or 3 or 5, right? As long as you keep it as the lowest number possible, right? Just keep it simple because all you want to do is to identify whether your angle is going to be a multiple of 360, right? So as you can see, if you have times 1, right? Remember, it's 45 plus 180n, so 1 being n, so you multiply that to 180, you get 225 degrees. Great, so we know that the second theta, right, or the second angle is 225, right? So now we're comparing 225 degrees and 45 degrees. So when you subtract the two, you get 180, right? So as you can see, 180 degrees is not a multiple of 360, right? So that's why C is false, and that's correct. Now let's move on to part D. Okay, so as you notice, basically they took 45 degrees plus negative 360 n degrees, right? So let's say you keep that n being 1, the same thing as what we did earlier. So because you're supposed to add the 2 first, right? So this would be 45, then you have minus 360 times 1. Remember, because n is 1. So this is actually negative 315, right? And when you add the 2, right? Because remember, negative 315, yeah, negative 315 degrees is basically your second angle, right? That's theta 2. So if you take 45 degrees and you take negative 315 degrees, and so far what we've been doing is we're taking the two angles. So let's say you have negative 315 minus 45 degrees, you're going to get negative 360. Okay, so let me try to illustrate that, just because I think what they did was they combined the two equations right off the bat. So that's why it's pretty confusing, I would say. So because so far from A to C, they're breaking this down into two equations. As you can see, they're adding the two and then they're subtracting. So maybe I can show you that. Okay, so you have 45 degrees. That's the angle. And then they're saying that you have a negative 360n, right? So you're supposed to add, so let n be equal to 1. And then you're saying that you have 360 times 1, right? That's your n. And that's going to be in degrees, right? Like the whole thing. So when you add the 2, and this is supposed to be negative 360. And how did I know that? Well, if you look at this, right, it says negative 360n. So this is going to be 45 minus 360. So you're supposed to get negative 315 degrees, right? So that's our angle. And then if you look at this, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to take the two angles, so this being theta 1. Again, you can reassign this being theta 2, it doesn't really matter, but as long as you get the multiple of 360, you should be fine. Okay, so I'm taking theta 2, which is part of this formula, right? So as you can see, if you have to apply this formula, right, which is theta 1 minus theta 2, right, you get 360. Or you can just take theta 2, which is what they've been doing so far, right? Theta 2, which is negative 315 degrees, and then you take you subtract the 2, right? And then you take theta 1, which is 45 degrees, right? We know that this is a positive angle, therefore you have the negative sign. When you distribute that, you get negative, right? So when you add the 2, right, technically it's negative 315 minus 45, so adding the 2, you would get negative 360 degrees. Okay, so can you guys see that? So now you know that negative 360 degrees is actually a multiple of 360, right? So that's why D is true, right? And that's what they said, D is true. And this is correct, so. Okay, great. I don't have anything to correct. I guess for part D, I just wanted to break it down even better into two equations. That's my only comment, but regardless, I think this is a perfect solution, so. So maybe we can leave that. Okay, so we said we wanted to have 45 degrees, two solution. Okay, so this is the two solutions. So we have 45 degrees, and then we have negative 360 times 1, and this is degrees. So we're going to get negative 315. Okay. Okay, so we had negative 315 degrees, and then the next step would be to have negative, actually 45, right? Sorry. Negative 315 degrees. And then we had minus 45 degrees.
It's 113 degrees Fahrenheit.
Okay, great. I apologize for that. Apparently, I think the Siri in my computer just like turned on. So can you still hear me? Okay, great. Anyways, let's go back to the question. Negative 45 degrees, and we said it was negative 360 degrees. Okay, great. So that's my comment. Solution is correct. Perfect.